Because what does it mean?
Well, we shouldn't take the military side too seriously, because the Russian military is just a husk of what used to be the real might of the Soviet military, and except for the nuclear missiles, which we're going to see trundling through the square shortly, I think, this is not a threat to the West. It is a big threat to Georgia, though, because just a man in crutches can be very intimidating if you're in a wheelchair, and Georgia's only 5 million people, and they're suffering the most extraordinary propaganda attacks and actually military pressure from Russia, which I think might not be a Cold War, but actually a small hot one.
But as I say, your book's called The New Cold War.
Yes, and that's because the real threat to the West is not the Russian military, but Russian money. It's banks, if you like, not tanks. And it's also the use of gas diplomacy to divide and rule Europe, which Russia's done very successfully, to the point that Germany now puts its relations with Russia ahead of its relations with its supposedly East European allies, both in the EU and in NATO.
Gideon, you say, Edward Lucas, not to direct a military threat to us, fairly obviously. But if there is a threat to some of Russia's neighbours, then we become involved sooner or later, don't we?
Absolutely, and Georgia is really vital. This is a country that really wants to be like us. It wants to be in the EU, it wants to be in NATO, it has a lively, even hysterical opposition, it has a strongly pro-Western president, and it's also absolutely vital for the point of view of oil and gas. This is the only route by which we can get oil and gas out of the Caspian and Central Asia into our part of the world on a route that's not controlled by Russia. So it's absolutely vital, and I'm really worried that the tepid response we've been seeing towards the great threat that Georgia is under is sending exactly the wrong signal to Russia that they can do what they want there, and we're not going to do anything.
You're not worried about that, Gideon?
Well, I was in Georgia a few weeks ago, and they're worried, and justifiably so. But, you know, I hope I don't come to regret these words, but I don't think you're going to see Russian tanks rolling through Tbilisi. There's been a difficult relationship between Georgia and Russia for some time now. The Russians are ratcheting up the pressure, but I think there's a limit to how far they want to push this, because, again, unlike the Cold War, we aren't two hostile blocs. There are lots of overlapping interests between the West and Russia. The Russians have big economic interests in the West, and we have big economic interests there.
But allowing for that, how far should we let them push it, assuming we have any say in the matter at all?
Well, you know, obviously what we can do is limited, but I think the Western response has been pretty strong. You know, you've had the Secretary-General of NATO coming out and making statements. You've had Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, ringing up the Russians, making our concern clear. So I don't think they're in any doubt that this is something we take seriously.
Come off it, Gideon. I mean, you know, the NATO response was to say, we are so worried about this, we're going to send NATO ambassadors are going to meet in Georgia by the end of the year. That's for you. What's really going to happen is a small group of European countries, the Baltic states and Sweden, who really care about this. They're sending their foreign ministers to meet in Tbilisi next week, I believe, and that's a sign. But it's also a sign of how divided the rest of Europe is, and that's the advantage. This is something we didn't have during the last Cold War, was that Russia was not really able to play divide and rule with NATO, and it is playing that game with us now.
Well, I mean, I think that, again, you know, I don't want to end up defending Russian pressure on Georgia, but
You're doing quite a good job of it.
No, I mean, I'm absolutely not. But I think you've got to sit rationally here in London or Washington and try to put it in a bigger picture. And I don't think that this is part of a generalised threat to the West, however unpleasant their behaviour may be.
Gideon Repman, Edward Lucas, thank you both very much.